Keyboards and controllers. This debate has always been a heated one, especially in the YouTube comment section. And it makes sense. The game was released almost 40 years ago for a console that obviously wasn't made for a keyboard. There's a reason why a bunch of new viewers just lose their minds over this. I mean, wouldn't you? It's one of the first things on screen. To the left of the gameplay, below the splits, in his hand cam. Right there in plain sight. One of the most influential games ever released, designed to be played on a console, on a controller, just the way Shigeru Miyamoto himself wanted it. And yet, he's playing on a keyboard?! Okay, let's start at the beginning. For most of the game's history, there was no such thing as a keyboard. Almost every top runner played on original hardware. Controller, console, that's just how it was. But after Niftski achieved his first any percent world record, a bunch of new viewers flocked towards the comment section to express their concerns. Some of these are reasonable, especially if you were new to Mario speedrunning. And some of them were just stupid. Remember that montage from the intro? Yeah, those comments are pretty much all from one video. Now, the community has decided that keyboards are on an equal playing field with controllers. Otherwise, Niftski wouldn't be using one. But clearly, there's a lot of uninformed people that don't know that. Maybe you're one of them. But don't worry, in this video, we're gonna help everyone out by going over literally everything. The potential advantages, the important details that you probably don't know about, and this one's popular, if playing on a keyboard actually ruins the spirit of the game. But first, don't forget to like and subscribe. Okay, with all that out of the way, let's get into the basics. Why do some people not play on an original controller? Well, the game came out almost 40 years ago, and original hardware is becoming harder and harder to come across. So, Niftski and countless other players have chosen to play on emulators instead. Emulators can let you play almost any retro video game on Earth on your computer. And don't worry, every emulator that speedrunners use is just as accurate as playing on the original console. Okay, so Niftski plays the game from 1985 on his computer every day, but how exactly does playing on a keyboard work? Well, think about it. Computers use keyboards, so it only makes sense that most emulators let you map inputs to keys on your keyboard, which allows you to control the game. In theory, you could play the game any way you want. D-pad on the left, on the right, in the middle, all over the place. There are countless options, but the most popular layout looks something like this. D-pad inputs controlled with WASD, and A and B controlled with some keys on the numpad.
But the original controller doesn't let you plus left plus right at the same time. That's easy to do on a keyboard. He must be cheating. You know, back in 87, I don't know about you cheaters, but I can do that crap!
No, you can just turn off left plus right inputs on your emulator. And also, you can actually press left plus right on a controller. It's just really stupid and hard to do. Finally, you can purchase USB controllers, and some people have used them in speedruns before, but most emulator players just don't feel like buying them, or simply prefer the feel of a keyboard. The feel of a keyboard. Well, for a number of years, keyboards have been allowed on the leaderboards.
So they're equal then, right?
Well, by the end of the video, you'll see that the answer is not exactly that black and white. Does playing on a keyboard give you an advantage? Let's find out. dropped inputs are probably the biggest difference between playing on a controller and a keyboard, and they're also the most controversial. No! 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 If you don't know what they are, it's when your controller doesn't register button presses, which happens frequently with faster inputs. Dropped inputs can be caused by a few things: dirty controllers, bad luck, or by simply pressing the button too fast, although many people don't like admitting that one. And don't worry, they can happen on keyboards every now and then, but they are by far the most common on controllers, especially when going for tricks that require one-frame jumps, or in other words, inputs that only last a 60th of a second. And the reason why they're more common on controllers is because of debounce. Now it's time to get a bit technical. When you press a key down, it can bounce around a bit, and sometimes this extra movement can register as multiple keystrokes if the switch gets triggered more than once. Here's what this looks like, courtesy of some random tech channel.
I am typing W twice on every line before pressing enter, and it types it 3 or 4 times in many lines.
Debouncing mechanisms detect these extra bounces and register them as only one keystroke to prevent you from typing like a lunatic. Many modern keyboards, especially mechanical ones, have built-in debounce to prevent double-clicking. For SMB, this greatly reduces the chances of dropped inputs on a keyboard, but a side effect is that some keyboards make it almost impossible to press keys for a frame, which is a deal breaker at a high level. There are fixes to this, but we'll get to that later. Meanwhile, the NES does not have a reliable debounce system, so although you'll almost always get a one-frame input, this comes at the cost of dropped inputs. And if you ask some top runners, this is definitely not a good trade-off.
So, having dealt with the issue myself, I would do anything to just play on hardware that ensures that I would get a jump every time I press A. Because at a top level, it legitimately becomes a major setback to just not be able to have jumps come out sometimes. Especially when you look at keyboard players who can just mindlessly flick and not have to deal with the issue. But at this point, it would be way too expensive to switch to emulator, and it would also take me a lot of time to just get used to emulator and stuff.
Okay, so far I've only talked about one-frame jumps, but NES controller D-pads are also notorious for dropped inputs and weird shenanigans.
Oh!
Especially when trying to press down.
What? No! No!
Unlike the previous point, this issue is mostly due to how a D-pad works, as well as the state of your controller. While keyboards have specific keys to press for each direction, a D-pad functions a lot more like a continuous button, which in return has a lot more room for error. This room for error is often called D-pad bullshit, especially by Lakuki. Here's an example of it. This is Eddie Cat Gaming, and right now, he's on borderline world record pace in Warpless All-Stars. Until this happened. Although he was only pressing down on his D-pad, which would have avoided taking damage, his controller instead inputted down plus right, which essentially killed the run. If Eddie was playing on a keyboard, that would have never happened. The same thing also applies the other way when trying to hold down plus right, which is crucial for modern flagpole glitch setups and the bullet bill glitch in 8-2. Here's what controller shenanigans for that can look like. At this point, you might think that keyboards have a major advantage, but don't worry, cause we're about to even things out a little bit. In most cases, Super Mario Bros. Has a friendlier learning curve when playing on a controller, especially if you're going for some high-level tricks. The best example of this is fast D-pad inputs, which are a lot easier to do on a controller, at least in the beginning anyway. This is mostly because the D-pad layout is just a lot more favorable. On a controller, all you need to do is flick your wrist a little bit and practice the timing. But on a keyboard, it's not that easy. As I mentioned earlier, emulators do allow you to disable inputting left and right at the same time, which is a requirement for speedrunning the game, but this comes at a cost. If you press left and right at the same time on a keyboard, the game just inputs nothing. This isn't a big deal when you're first starting out, but when you need to go in between left and right really fast, it's very easy to accidentally press both keys at the same time. I will say, once you get it down, it's manageable. Just look at Niftski. And honestly, accounting for D-pad bullshit, keyboards and controllers are probably about equal with this at the highest level. But in the short term, it definitely sucks for keyboard users. On the same topic, tying the tasks in the first room of 8-4 is just simply almost impossible on a keyboard. I'm not saying that it's easy on a controller though. It's still only possible through ridiculous grips and some D-pad luck, but that's a lot better than being straight up unviable. Okay, you might think that buying an entire NES is expensive, and sometimes it might not be that cheap. But if you want to play at a top level on an emulator, you might need to fork over some cash too, because the keyboard you play on can be the difference between being a top player and being another 457.5.
Did it! I freaking did it!
As I mentioned earlier, debounce can make one-frame inputs impossible on some keyboards, so many top runners, such as Niftski, have chosen to purchase specific keyboards that work best with the game. The most popular one over the last few years has been the Logitech G815, which you've definitely seen before, because it's been all over this video. This one is pretty nice, and so far, the best one that people have found. Oh, and it costs $200, which is more than an actual NES setup. At least in North America anyway. People living in countries that use PAL video usually have a much harder time finding decently priced consoles. If you live in Europe, for example, you should probably just stick to an emulator. When it comes to playing video games, how comfortable a controller feels is very important. And for Super Mario Bros, we've kind of got the short end of the stick, because we use the NES controller. It's literally called a brick, okay? These things may not break, but they're not the most comfortable controller out there. For everything except extremely fast D-pad inputs, keyboard is just better on your hands. Although, this really isn't the biggest issue. If you can handle calluses and the occasional blisters on your thumb from a controller, you'll be just fine. Okay, this is a weird one, because what I'm about to say is true for basically everyone. Keyboards are a lot more durable than controllers. Yes, a little while back I called them bricks, but they're only that strong if you're smashing them on the ground. For 99% of players, once you buy a keyboard, you probably never have to buy a new one. Unless you're Niftski. Then you go through 13 keyboards in 3 years. Shoutouts to Best Buy returns, I guess. But yeah, on a controller, you probably will need to replace some parts or at least clean it out every few months. Although in some cases, people have had controllers last for years. The one positive thing about replacing your controller parts is that you do have a small amount of control over the consistency and feel of it, but that just makes no difference, no matter how much the cookie tells you it's a game changer. Instead, it's probably just better to find a controller that lets you do everything you needed to do right off the bat. The only problem is, that's a lot easier said than done, especially at a high level.
The thing that has plagued me along with every other controller player for years has been finding the elusive perfect controller for SMB1. A controller that never drops an input, is able to do specific D-pad input strings, is able to do down plus right comfortably, and never left plus rights. Finding all these things in one controller is extremely rare, so many of us have had to resort to either Frankensteining random parts together until you create something that's good enough, or playing the eBay lottery until you find a good controller. Neither of which are things that are particularly fun or sustainable.
Okay, I've pretty much talked about everything. Well, except for this. Let's address the elephant in the room. Does playing on a keyboard ruin the spirit of the game? Well, a few weeks ago, I asked you guys this very question on my YouTube community tab, and here are the results. Although it is a clear majority in favor of keyboards, there's still a decent amount of people that disagree. About 16% of you guys. And where do I stand on this? Well, For me, it's a bit of a mixed bag. On one hand, I gotta admit, keyboards do allow for a lot more people to get into speedrunning the game.
Yes!
I started out on keyboard, and so did a lot of other top runners. But at the same time, there's just nothing that can beat the original feeling of playing on original hardware, on a CRT TV, with an original controller. Honestly, I could never go back to playing on an emulator. And when it comes to keyboard being an advantage or not, I just look to Niftski. You might be thinking, well, he plays on a keyboard, but he's also really good on controller. At all the in-person events this year, he was destroying the competition on a controller. If you want to learn more about this, watch Cosmic's video, which I'll put in the description. He goes over this really well. So yeah, I think keyboard and controller are pretty much equal. But that's just my opinion. In reality, it all comes down to personal preference and what you value in a speedrun.
As someone who mains keyboard and has a 454 on controller, I don't think that neither keyboard or controller has an objective advantage in general. There are only a few things in the game that either keyboard or controller make a bit easier, but as far as gameplay goes, I'd say they're around 99% the same with everything. At the end of the day, I think people should choose what they're most comfortable with, which is what I do and is why I prefer keyboard over controller.
I do definitely prefer the feel of using a controller. Just something about it, like I feel like cool or something. I don't know, I can't explain it, but it's just nice.
Personally, I don't think that anything is lost through playing on emulator and keyboard. Emulators are called that for a reason. They emulate the game exactly as it would be on a real NES. Ultimately, I believe it just comes down to a matter of preference for how you want to experience it.
When I first started practicing Super Mario Bros., I played on emulator with the keyboard. After getting console equipment of my own, I instantly enjoyed playing on NES a lot more. I felt like my practice was increasing my consistency at an accelerated rate. However, as I improved, various controller-specific issues became more and more of a problem for me. I feel that keyboards have become a more compelling option to play the game with less frustration. Regardless, I still definitely prefer using controller and playing on a CRT.
The simple fact with keyboards and controllers is that their practical pros and cons invariably even out, and the small nuances that lead to tricks being easier only really start to show up at the top level. With that being said, I do believe that a portion of the classic image of speedrunning, of popping around to a friend's house and blowing their minds in their games, on their terms, on their hardware, is just lost on keyboard. And therefore, console feels more authentic and immersive to me. It's completely personal, but to me, playing on console and controller is simply more fun.
In this video, I tried to be as neutral as I possibly could. But if playing on a keyboard is still a major deal breaker for you, I get it. Even if every top runner thinks it's an equal playing field, for some people, playing the game on a keyboard will just never beat the authentic feeling of playing the game how they intended it. And in that sense, you've got a point. But as it is right now, in 2023, with an emulator player on top of the leaderboards, destroying almost every world record in the game, you're just gonna have to cry about it. Thanks for watching.